I'm interviewing Rich Luterman.
Hello! Good afternoon. Can everyone say partly cloudy? Say partly cloudy. That's it. You are now a meteorologist. That's all it takes. I studied meteorology at Penn State for 4 years to learn how to say partly cloudy. Keep going.
Okay. My overall question for the interview today is, how does climate change affect trade routes? And so my first question for you is, what is some history behind this?
Climate and trade routes. Now, I'm just going to start talking here. I know there's no right or wrong here, but trade routes have evolved over the years. You know, the trade routes that were used 300 years ago when the French were coming through the Great Lakes looking for animal fur. You know, there's still trade routes to the Great Lakes, but now it's all modern navigation and modern aviation, so we don't trade the same way that we used to.
Yeah.
But obviously, climate change affects everything. It affects things like agriculture. It affects the type of agriculture. You know, where certain corns were grown hundreds of years ago, now perhaps different strains of corns are grown because climate affects everything. And just like in the Great Lakes with the fur trade, obviously we have a lot less furs in the Great Lakes because now everything has been populated by human beings for the most part. So the history of trade and climate goes back thousands and thousands of years. Remember, there was a land bridge at one time that connected Russia to Alaska. And obviously it doesn't exist anymore. So climate has changed that. So before, the people that lived up there could just walk across the land bridge and come into Alaska, but now they have to get on their boats and sail across. And of course the weather affects that passage. So just like climate affects a lot of things that we do in our lives, it also would affect all of the trade routes, and that includes boats and trains and horseback and just people walking with goods on their back. You know, obviously people do better in good weather. So where there is harsher weather, you know, usually you find less people. You know, if you ever look at Canada as a nation, most of the population of Canada lives right near the U.S.-Canadian border, because the further north you go, the colder, the harsher it gets. And same with Russia and parts of Europe. You know, the farther north you go, the harsher it is. And conversely, the closer you get to the equator, it's very harsh. You know, with continuous hot weather, you know, day after day, week after week, season after season. So we're lucky in a sense that we live in these temperate zones of the world where we have 4 seasons, but yet, you know, climate is not 1 season or 2 seasons. Climate is this cycle of weather that can last hundreds and thousands of years. So at one time where we're sitting was all glacial ice, believe it or not. So now that the ice has retreated, it's a lot easier to get around, but 10,000 years ago we wouldn't be having this conversation. Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
All right, fire away.
Okay, my next question is, what natural weather disasters have the greatest impact on trade routes?
Everything from hurricanes to drought. You know, you always think of severe weather, meaning something that's falling from the sky, but drought has been one of the greatest challenges to civilization throughout the millennia, because when there's no rain, things aren't growing. And if that lasts for 2 or 3 or 4 years, this you know, a given drought, you know, people have to leave the area. You know, not anymore, although there are still parts of the world that are greatly affected by drought. But here in the United States, you know, people live where they live, but there was a time, something like a drought, which could last years, versus a hurricane, which only lasts a few days. You know, there's a wide variation, and everything in between. You have tornadoes, you have hailstorms. You know, we think of hailstorms around Michigan, these little pea-like things that ping off our windshield. But hail causes tremendous damage in the nation's heartland, especially to crops. So here's a farmer out in Nebraska or Kansas growing all these beautiful fields of corn, and here comes a big hailstorm, and it can literally demolish the little shoots, the little corn shoots, early in the season. So hurricanes, tornadoes, drought, hail, cold snaps, stretches of very cold weather. Remember a few years ago, like almost the entire apple crop was wiped out in Michigan because of the harsh winter. And that was just one winter. So climate change, it's everywhere in our society, including, how we trade and how we used to trade in the past.
Yeah.
Fire away.
Okay. My next question is, what has modern day society invented to help lessen the impact of severe weather on trade routes?
The first serious invention in modern meteorology was a weather radar, and it was developed in the late 1930s, early 1940s. And weather radar simply sends out electronic transmissions or pulses of energy, and then it knows what's out there by sound waves. So weather radar uses sound to determine where the rain is, where the snow is, where the hail is. And now modern day Doppler radar can actually determine if there's spin going on in a given part of the sky, and that usually helps us figure out if a tornado may develop. So weather radar has been around since the late 1930s, early 1940s. Very important. Weather radar is everywhere in the United States. The nearest weather radar to us is up in White Lake Township, and that's operating 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, all year long. The other serious invention that changed, revolutionized modern meteorology was satellites, the use of weather satellites, and that started in the early 1960s. And simply put, weather satellites are cameras that are in orbit above our Earth, taking pictures of the Earth. And that's an important concept because back, I believe it was 1900, when the Great Galveston hurricane struck Texas, and it killed, I think, 9,000 people in one hurricane. And the reason why it caused so much loss of life is because we didn't know the storm was even out in the Gulf of Mexico before it came ashore. So with the advent of satellites, we take pictures of the Earth all the time. So never again will we be caught off guard by a hurricane moving in from the Gulf of Mexico, or perhaps getting close to Florida or the Carolinas. We can't stop them from happening, but at least with satellites we can see the storms before they get close to the United States. Very important. And also satellites can help us determine the storms that may form tornadoes. So radar and satellites have really revolutionized everything about weather, and hence back to your trade routes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, I'm on a roll.
Okay, and my last question for you.
Sweating it out here.
Would you say the impact climate change has on trade routes is a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's neither. I don't think it's good or bad. Weather and climate have been happening long before we were here, and it will continue to happen.
Yeah.
So it's really up to man, civilization with technology to change in the face of climate change. And that includes trade, and that includes agriculture, and that includes economies and manufacturing. I mean, everything's affected by weather. It's a good question, and the answer is, it's the certainty of life, is that the weather will come and go, and the seasons will change, and sometimes Mother Nature goes against us. Sometimes the weather is not good for farmers, and then some years it is good for farmers. And then some years bring very harsh winters to the Great Lakes, where the lakes will freeze over completely. Like this past winter was one of the harshest winters on record.
Yeah.
And the Great Lakes were almost completely frozen over, which doesn't happen very often. But that slowed all the shipping down to a stop. Some ships still traverse the Great Lakes, even in the winter. But when the lakes are frozen over, everything comes to a screeching halt. So the answer is, say that question one more time.
Would you say the impact climate change has on trade routes is a good thing or a bad thing?
I would say it's neither. I would say it's just a fact of life for the trading business.
Okay.
Is that good?
Yeah, that's good.
How did I do? Did I do okay? Can everyone say partly cloudy? Go ahead.
Partly cloudy.
That's it. See that $1 million smile right there? Shh. We'll put her on TV.
Okay, well, that is all the questions I have for you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope I provided some insight into an interesting hypothesis there. Very interesting.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.